This is the fourth installment of the six-part series that we're running this spring through the Human Rights and Social Movements program at the Carr Center called the Activist Studio. And tonight's theme is slavery and human rights. And we are very, very happy, Rose Styron and I are very pleased to have Kevin Bales and Ashley Judd with us tonight. And I'll just introduce them in a second. I'd like to mention that this event tonight, this particular iteration of the Activist Studio, is co-sponsored by the Initiative to Stop Human Trafficking at the Carr Center. And so I'd like to particularly thank Christina Bain in the front row here, who generously co-sponsored this event and has worked hard with the staff at the Carr Center to put it together. Christina, thank you. It's an honor again to collaborate. Let me just introduce Kevin and Ashley briefly, and then I'll pass it over, very briefly, and then I will pass it over to Rose, who will start the questioning. Kevin Bales is the president of Free the Slaves, which is the American sister organization to Anti-Slavery International. Kevin is one of, or probably the, leading scholar of modern-day slavery. His book, Disposable People, published in 1999, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, really opened up, in many ways, initiated a whole new field of study about modern-day slavery and human trafficking. And since then, I think that those of us who toil in this vineyard are very much owe that work, or were inspired first to do that work by Kevin. I should just say one other quick thing about Kevin, and then he's won Emmys and all sorts of prizes and so forth and consulted governments. But the thing that I most admire about Kevin is that he comes here whenever I ask him to come. He has been lecturing for free, essentially, to my undergraduate course, American Protest Literature, from Tom Paine to Tupac, since we started teaching that course in 2002. Every year he comes, and every year he inspires. And one year in particular, he inspired a group of undergraduates to begin a Harvard chapter of Free the Slaves, which now is doing all sorts of amazing movement work, both here at the college and also in Boston and throughout the country and globe. And so Kevin is an inspiration not only to those of us who are his colleagues, but also to those who are the next generation of activists. And so Kevin, it's an honor as well to have you here.
I come because it's Tom Paine to Tupac. But they do some of my work just before they do Tupac. And it's like the only time in my whole life when I've been in the same zone as Tupac. How can I not do that?
He is. It's right before we get to hip-hop, we get to Kevin Bales. We should say American Protest Literature from Bales to Beyonce. I think will be the new iteration of the course. Right. God, that sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah. And then we also are honored here to have Ashley Judd, who is a mid-career student here, an MPA, mid-career student at the Kennedy School. Ashley wears many hats, among her most
and garbage bags. And wore a garbage bag walking over from the law school.
She wore a garbage bag walking over here. Okay, great. In addition to her work as an actress and a documentary filmmaker, she is also on the board of directors of Population Services International. And she joined that board in 2004 after serving as global ambassador for PSI's HIV education and prevention program, Youth AIDS, since 2002. Ashley is a committed human rights advocate and has traveled all over the world and has testified before Congress and has done an enormous amount of work, not only in the areas of HIV/AIDS and empowering women and children, but also on human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And it was amazing. I saw her on TV, on Joy Behar's show recently, demonstrating clean water purification on the show. Joy Behar did not know what to do with you or with that, but I loved that moment on TV. It was one of those insomnia moments where I can't sleep, but wow, this is great TV. And with that, I will pass it over to my dear friend and colleague, Rose Styron, to start us off.
So some people are standing in the back. In fact, there's kind of a bench seat over here, which is a lot of people sitting on that side, but this one's completely open. So if you want to come sit, come sit.
Rose.
Well, I just wondered, and I'm going to, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. You two have come to your work from such different angles, and I just wonder if you would each tell me a little bit about what in your childhood or adulthood or the road to Damascus got each of you involved in this work on slavery. Why don't you start, Ashley?
We have to share.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much to the Carr Center and Free the Slaves and all the wonderful cohort who are so actively involved in abolition. I'm really honored and pleased to be here. And it's interesting that you mentioned the road to Damascus, which is obviously the road on which Paul had his conversion experience, and walking over here in my glamorous garbage bag. A friend literally used that word, talking about my conversion to this work. And to try to be very direct and answer your question, I'm a survivor of abandonment and neglect. And so I think that I was conditioned from childhood to have an enormous sensitivity to all forms of abuse. And I really identify with, although my experience was not the same, I identify with the feelings that folks who suffer have. And then when I went to college, the University of Kentucky, between the years of '86 and '90, I immediately became a rabble-rouser. That was my, well, first I was a Kappa, I joined a sorority, and immediately on the heels of that identity, I became a rabble-rouser.
Literally on the heels.
And it was very interesting that I joined a mainstream organization, but then immediately became a real minority within that organization. And of the instigating I did included staging a campus-wide walkout of classes to protest the fact that our school had not yet divested from the apartheid government, which I found unconscionable and unacceptable. And so while my sisters would be in the dining room visiting and, you know, getting a wonderful education and probably chatting about boys, I would be in the kitchen talking to our African-American cook about why she wouldn't send her kids to the University of Kentucky. She'd take the money in a paycheck and take the modest health benefits, but she wouldn't send her kids there. So I also joined Amnesty International. I was a regular at candlelight vigils at Triangle Park in Lexington, Kentucky. That's how I spent my time, and it was the stuff that comprised my meaning making at UK. And another brief example of that is A.B. Happy Chandler, who was a beloved governor as well as baseball commissioner, was signing copies of his book, and my friends were in line to get his autograph, and I was protesting him. So I've always had that kind of heart and consciousness. And I was joining the Peace Corps, and the very last minute started to evade my recruiter and went to another kind of jungle, as I say, Hollywood, very much at the last minute. I was afraid that if I didn't take a shot at making films, I would literally never come home from Africa. And whatever that artistic and creative impulse in me was would go unsatisfied through the whole of my life. And I didn't want to rob myself of that potential experience. Had no idea if I would make a success of it, but it was important for me to try. And cut to 2003, I was making a picture. I was quite miserable, and within the same week, Bono, who's been a friend of mine since I was 19 years old, called me with his friend and partner, Bobby Schreiber, who's like a brother to me, asking me if I would become involved in raising awareness about the global HIV/AIDS emergency. And the same week that I got that call, and so this is about signs and symbols and paying attention to what's going on in your life, a very dynamic woman called Kate Roberts sent me a letter asking me if I would be the Global Ambassador for Youth AIDS, which is, Tim mentioned, is the HIV/AIDS Prevention Initiative at Population Services International. So quite out of the blue, these two very interesting, committed people who had the potential to offer me extraordinary opportunities that would literally change my life, knocked on my door practically simultaneously. And so I started to work with Debt AIDS Trade in Africa, which was Bono and Bobby and Jamie Drummond's first organization, DATA, which is a precursor to the One Campaign to End Poverty. And I took my first trip with PSI to Cambodia, and the great Musakoa, who actually spoke here last week, at that time she was Minister of Women's Affairs in Cambodia, basically threw me into my first brothel. And so that is how I stumbled upon the modern slave trade, and in particular sex slavery. I didn't really discover labor slavery, about which I'm equally committed to ending, until I started spending more time in sub-Saharan Africa. And since I've been to Cambodia, I've visited 12 developing countries and really spent a great deal of time in brothels, both formal and informal, and in labor camps, which I find, I don't know, there's something about, maybe because I'm a woman and I have my own sexuality, I'm better able to kind of sit in brothels and be present, and then do my devastation later, and do my feelings about it later. There's something about the labor stuff that I can't even write about it. I've written about 550 pages of diaries so far, but I've never written about the labor peace. It really shatters me. So that's a bit of my background.
Well, that's incredibly interesting for me to hear, since Amnesty International is where I came from, and that's what woke me up, and all those candlelight figures from the South did that too. And I'll have lots more questions to ask you in a minute, but I want to hear about Kevin.
Maybe it's that odd kind of radicalism that comes out of being Southern. You know, I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and I don't know if people know that, but from a family that all comes from Mississippi. But the parts about that early childhood stuff that were so powerful for me was about growing up in a community, a small community in rural Oklahoma, but it was all torn to pieces and patched back together out of a whole series of different Indian tribes, African Americans, immigrants, and then Okie rednecks like my family, right? Who were in themselves right out of poverty. My sisters and I were the first ones to ever reach higher education in our family. And the grandfather, who was the sharecropper, could barely read and write. So, you know, there was that plus different Indian tribes that I grew up with, all of whom hated each other and hated the African Americans. They all hated the white people. White people weren't so sure about the black Americans or the Indians. It was like, you know, growing up in this strange maelstrom of tension that was never externalized. That was part of it. It turned me into a social scientist, I think. That led me into doing academic work that helped me to think through what on earth did I just grow up in? This curiosity of different types of allegiances and social groups and social classes, ethnicities. But all of that, I have to say, I'm going to skip over a bunch of that. I did a lot of student activism as well. You know, got arrested like you did, I'm sure. But, you know, the moment for me really occurs in the early 90s when, having even taught human rights and having done work for human rights organizations, I pick up a leaflet in London. I lived in London about 20 years. I pick up a leaflet in London and at a public event, at a kind of big party on the South Bank in London, and I pick up this leaflet that says, there are millions of slaves in the world today. And I will admit to hubris, because I looked at this and thought, you know, I'm like a hotshot young professor. And how can this be true if I don't know it? Which I think anyone at Harvard can probably relate to that. I thought, this how can this be true? And then, but also thought, you know, well, and if it is true, you know, how come I don't know it? And I began to read this leaflet, and it was all full of anecdotes and outrage. You know, there are women caught in prostitution. There are little boys who are camel jockeys in Saudi, and there are people trapped in debt bondage. But it was only anecdotes. But I was a professor of social research methods and human rights. I taught quantitative methods. I thought, wait, if this is slavery, if this is actually something that's as old as human history and part of the global economy, we can't just tell anecdotes about it. We have to actually understand the size and the shape and the function and the way it all fits together, and how does it work in the global economy, and what does this mean for political and policy and so forth. And the more I began to dig in the early 90s, the more I found nothing. And I mean, it was just before spring break. I went to the library and ran a literature search on slavery. I came out with about 3,000 articles, academic articles. 2,998 of them were about historical slavery. Only 2 were about contemporary. So I remember them perfectly. And they were even useful. One was a theoretical piece by a Marxist Indian sociologist at JMU. And one was a very interesting but very small piece about Peruvian Indians by the anthropologist Tom Grass, also a Marxist. But that was it. And I realized this is either like doesn't exist, or it's the biggest mystery of human rights on the planet. And I began to go to other places to find information, and then I found a lot. Anti-Slavery International is key to this. And I went on the board of trustees and like that. But here's the key thing. Driven by curiosity, this idea that there's this knowledge that I just can't find answers to. That was curiosity has always been a powerful driver for me. But the change came when I went into the field to study this, and I met people in slavery. And if you haven't met people in slavery, I will tell you right now, it breaks your heart. It breaks your heart. There's no scientific, specialist, academic, cold, objective way to say that process. I mean, I suppose we could mess it up and say secondary traumatic responses, but it breaks your heart. And that changes you in your approach to your work. Now, I didn't stop being a professional, methodological social scientist, but I became one who had a broken heart, who had to act on that. And that's when I began to think, I can't spend the rest of my life in the classroom. I've got something, I think, bigger to do. Now, there's one other little part to this, and it has something to do with faith as well, because I'm a Quaker, right? And, you know, Quakers are woolly, and they're confused, and who knows what we really believe.
And they're calm.
But they're calm, sometimes they're calm, and sometimes they argue about what we don't believe or whatever. But, you know, if there's any unity among Quakers, it's that we all pat ourselves on the back and say, we may be confused and woolly now, but didn't we do a good job on slavery, right? Because we were all in those early abolitionist movements, and it was like, okay, we're hopeless now, but we did a good job on slavery like 150 years ago. Okay, I get look into the depths of this, and I realize we didn't finish the job. We didn't finish the job. Now, the reason why that's important to me as in my faith community is that Quakers never put a time limit. We have a testament, what we call a promise, like a testimony, that we're going to work against war until war is finished. We did the same thing with slavery. And then we didn't deliver the goods. We dropped the ball. And I thought, I've got to go back to my faith community as well and say, guys, we blew it. If we think we stopped slavery, we didn't. And it's time to get that going. So, that's another little zone for me, is that we made a promise, a collective promise, and we didn't keep it. And that ain't right.
Well, as a woolly Quaker myself, I'm very happy.
You look too stylish to be a Quaker.
Speaking of stylish, I'm a gay recovering Catholic. But that's another session. Therapy session. In fact, probably more than one. We're having fun tonight. Kevin, I wanted to, and actually I absolutely feel free to weigh in on this too, but this is more specifically directed at Kevin. We've had an ongoing conversation, you and I, for a number of years now about the way that slavery changes over time. But I want to ask you, and it does, right? We know that every human society, or every society in human history has had some form of slavery. That continues to be the case. It doesn't always look the same. It changes over time and space. And some of the most important historical work from people in my field, I'm more of a humanist than a social scientist, but historians kind of straddle that weird line. But some of the most insightful work about slavery that comes out of the work that historians do is that it does vary and change over time and space. But another insight that has been a recent one since the 60s, since the Civil Rights Movement, is what Edmund Morgan called the slavery freedom paradox, right? The idea that the birth of American freedom rested and depended on the existence of American slavery. And that these two things weren't a contradiction, right? That slavery wasn't a contradiction of freedom, but they actually both needed one another in order to be defined. And when you think about the modern history of slavery as it relates to human rights, slavery since the late 18th century, since the Enlightenment explosion of ideas like freedom and equality and self-determination, the rights of man, rights of people, slavery has always been a violation of some sense of human rights, of equality, freedom, and so forth. And yet, it continues to be a violation of the human rights ideals that we raise up as the things we all aspire to that should govern our lives and rule our lives. So I'm wondering if you could talk not about the changes of slavery in the modern period, but whether or not you think that there is a change in the relationship between those great human rights principles that we hold up and talk about and that give us a sense of fulfillment about our human promise, and this hideous institution, which is as tenacious and as creative and as brutal today as it has ever been in human history.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is that I'm not sure that I agree with Morgan about that paradox, okay, and the idea that they were fundamentally necessary to one another. because I find it a strange echo in that argument, in the echo of pre-Civil War slavery apologists who would always harken back to ancient Greece and say the reason why civilization flourished in the classical period was because it rested on this bed of slavery. Now, I'm not saying that's not the same argument as saying freedom is set into contrast through slavery, but in a way they were saying intellectual freedom, which led to the greatest moments that they saw in human history, which was classical Greek culture, which was slightly off. It was their understanding. They said couldn't have occurred without that slavery. And to my mind, you know, it wasn't that. It was in fact the greatest failure of the expression of our common notions of freedom that came at the beginning of this country. And in some ways the fact that the true notions of individual freedom that were arising out of the Enlightenment, and from people like Tom Paine, were subversive, and Thomas Jefferson were, and of course they were conflicted, right? Because they weren't recovering Catholics, but they still had that zone of conflict that they had to live in. But they saw that idea, and that it was a failure, not a necessary contrast in my mind. It was a failure to stand up for what they actually believed in so many ways, and to make those compromises that led to those bizarre compromises about 3/5 of a person and all that kind of. I mean, that was just insane. So I don't necessarily buy that notion. The interesting thing about the rights, the notion of how we look up to these rights and how slavery fits to that, is that slavery itself was in many ways, you can argue, was the very first human right. That what is a right, and how does a right come about? Well, my understanding is that a right occurs when a collective or a sufficient number of people redefine in their own minds a set of actions. Now, I know that sounded very vague, but what I mean by that is, if you have this economic activity where you use one type of beast of burden to do a certain kind of economic activity, and it's a profit, and it supports churches and everything else, and then someone says, wait, I actually have to redefine that in my mind because of empathy that I'm beginning to feel for the beast of burden. That's not economics. That's slavery, right? That's not about making a living or having a business. That's actually about an exploitation. And it was that transformation through empathetic understanding that led to people redefining a set of actions that we now call slavery from being an economic activity to being a moral activity. Now, what's wonderful about that, and I think it hasn't been sufficiently studied, is that transformation of redefinition from economic to moral activity, is that it led the way, I believe, to open up the wave of rights which continues to wash over us, to move through our societies, so that more and more activities, whether they are homophobic discrimination, which used to be called sane, right, isolation of deviance, right, the redefinition into homophobic discrimination is part of that wave of redefinitions that occurs. Now, the reason why I think that we actually still are suffering from this situation of slavery, there are several parts to it, but if we hold it in the conceptual sense, it has to do with the fact that one of the things that you forget first are the oldest. And in a sense, it's like, a bit like the Quakers did. We said, oh, that one's done. And now we've got to fight the fights at the moment. And that leaves us to abandon a job that we haven't really quite worked through. Now, of course, it also came back and kind of slapped us in the back of the head because there was a rebound after the end of the Cold War that was exacerbated by the population explosion and economic change after that, and so forth. So there was an explosive growth after about 1960. But all of that said, it still meant that we weren't on guard. We had dropped our guard for that.
Wow. That's terrific. So now I'm going to turn to Ashley again. I have so many questions for both of you. But since you've been such an outspoken advocate for human rights in all different directions, from women and children's rights, clean water rights, and HIV/AIDS, and all types of modern day slavery. And you're also an actress. I'm really interested in the way artists, actresses, chief among them, use their skills and creativity to help the world in human rights, and how you balance your work as an actress with your work as an activist and still come out on top as a scholar.
So try to address a little bit of that.
Any piece of it will do.
Well, I was very lucky because when I went to Hollywood, I had a pretty quick entry into filmmaking. I started actually in television, which was a great place without a whole lot of consequences to learn how to hit my mark and find my key light and why it was important to be on time and the distinction between a grip and a gaffer and all those neat things. And I really dedicated myself pretty exclusively to that for a number of years, although that wasn't my intention when I got there. When I was planning to move out west, a family friend was saying, you know, just kind of asking me what my plan was, and I said, well, I'm going to be on the Planned Parenthood contact list so I can help escort women into clinics. I'm going to work on anti-discrimination against homosexual, you know, I mean, and he's like, are you going to save the world, or are you going to do some acting? Well, he didn't know that he was being prescient. But as I said, in 2003, I had that real turning point because I was sufficiently jaded at that moment in time with making films for my own reasons. And this wonderful opportunity came along. And so since then, I've had a balance that I really enjoy. I don't make a whole lot of pictures anymore, and that's one of the reasons why I think I respond sometimes quite rudely when people approach me because they perceive me as an actor, because it's such a small part of my whole existence. It's something I esteem and value, and it butters my bread and pays my tuition. It means I don't have to go to all those government loan meetings that seem to take up so much of my cohort's time. Thank you, God. But it's just such a small part of who I am and what I do. And in addition to working with PSI and a lot of tremendous smaller regional NGOs to whom I've been introduced by traveling all over the world, such as APNI App in India and Women for Women International, which I absolutely love and adore, really amazing. I'm on the board of Defenders of Wildlife, which is how I support my environmental work, and I do a lot of things regionally in Kentucky and Tennessee. So it's about, for me, leveraging my core values and constantly leading with what is most meaningful to me. And the great Catherine Chon, who's here tonight, said that when she was in college, a professor said to her classmates and her, what is your outrage? Well, I wasn't fortunate enough to have someone so succinctly put that question to me that I was already trying to answer it for myself. I had so much righteous indignation, and it keeps me really fed and motivated, particularly when it deals with gender inequality, which I really think is fundamental to so many of the problems. And I'm taking a class at Harvard Law with Diane Rosenfeld. I highly recommend her as a professor. Anything she teaches is special. But this gender-based violence class, Law and Social Justice, has brought up all of these intriguing elements, the male-to-male alliances, the continuum of violence. I had this one thing written down that Andrea Dworkin, of course, so radically and progressively talked about with regards to pornography: hierarchy, degradation, submission, and violence, all of which is very present and necessary for slavery, whether it's sex or labor. So I, hope when I finish school and have a nice long rest, I'd love to make a picture this year. I definitely am interested in continuing films, particularly material that I develop, which reflects my real values and passions. But I'm also going to apply, I think, for a White House fellow position. So it's, why not? Why not? And so, in addition to talking just about this, I hope that when people leave, especially students, you take with you the idea that it's really wonderful and necessary to exercise the fullness of your personhood.
I'm just one more little follow-up question on film. Did this film, which you only do for part of the time now, in any way, or did any of the roles you play feed your outrage and compassion and insight so that even those characters pushed you where you were going?
Well, has anybody seen Bug? I mean, I think that in a way, some of the roles I played were siphoning off my anger, so that I didn't necessarily have that intrinsic anger inhering to my personality day in and day out, because I was able to blow off a lot of steam through acting. And you know, I'm obviously not impressed with the way in which women are most often depicted in Hollywood. And I just read a script that's very funny. It'll make hundreds of millions of dollars. It stars your favorite people, and I'm breaking it down for my gender-based violence class because it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's everything from voyeurism to pedophilia to, you know, the male-to-male alliance. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And so I wasn't as willing to criticize that when I was exclusively an actor for hire. I no longer am, and I am criticizing it.
But are the films that you're going to make, will they be documentaries, or will they be?
Well, I loved Call and Response, of which I was a part. That was an interesting film, which is about the modern slave trade. And then I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to narrate the new movie by Bill Billheimer called Not My Life, which is about slavery. He made a wonderful film called A Closer Walk. And then the three I'm developing aren't specifically about slavery, but one is very much about the exploitation of the environment and people in Appalachia. So it's definitely part of my social justice work.
I want to pick up on that, the conversation about documentary film. There's a long documentary tradition that is linked with social activism, right? Whether you're talking about photography in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you know, film in the more modern period. There are all of these ways in which the way to document social ills is a way to represent visually often the injustices that sort of still plague us. And so documentary film in particular becomes, I think, a tool for social advocacy and social activism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, both of you have done documentary work. Kevin, I know that's where you won your Emmys and your Peabody. And actually you've done, more recently, have been engaged in documentary film work. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that medium becomes such a powerful one for particularly human rights advocacy, or advocacy to eradicate injustice. And then I also want you to not just talk about that, but then to take it a little bit deeper and to think about whether documentary film, the act of representing a social injustice, has limits. What is the line, the representational or artistic line, between representation and exploitation?
Sean?
Please do.
Well, and Tim, I'm really glad you put on the second question, because as you were asking the first question, I thought, I'm going to flip back to him and say, I don't think it's powerful. I don't necessarily think documentary filmmaking is as powerful as it really ought to be.
That's why I asked you the second.
Yeah, which is why you asked me the second question. So why did I read it? Because you're so wise. Of course, documentary filmmaking can make a powerful impact on an individual, and does. And I was very lucky to get to work with some great documentarians and so forth. And of course, when I've seen films that move me very deeply, I mean, you can even point to occasional documentary films that start whole movements. You know, like Kathy Come Home, which you may not know because it's a British film, but it started an anti-homelessness movement in Great Britain. Now, but it's a limited audience vehicle. And one of the things that I feel so strongly about, and I'm glad you asked this question, because just what Ashley had talked about took me to a hobby horse of my own, which is, if you look across the films and the written work about contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking, I have to say I don't see really profound work, right? You know, someone was talking about the film Taken today, but you know, it was Hollywood, and it's great if you have a CIA father who can kill all the people. That's great, you know, but it's all about the myth of redemptive violence solving the problems, which doesn't work, and it's not about reconciliation, it's not about rehabilitation and so forth. And I feel a real concern about the fact that our documentaries and our fictional accounts, both in writing and in filmmaking so far, none of them have reached the kind of power and depth of a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I'll tell you the reason why I think this is...
Which itself had limits.
Which of course had limits, but now that was a book with impact. That beyond anything any documentary film, in relative terms, I think has ever occurred, achieved on this issue. And I think one of the key reasons for that is that we keep making films and books about the problem and not about the people. You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin is not about slavery, it's about families. And it's about how families deal with the moral issue of living with slavery and how their families are destroyed by slavery, the slaveholding family and the slave families. And I think someday, some filmmaker is going to be brave to say, I'm going to make, you know, War and Peace is not about War and Peace. It's about families dealing with War and Peace. And on like this. You know, it's going to be about the individuals and the emotions and the relationships. And someone's going to be deep enough and smart enough to say, this isn't one more retelling of, oh, these women were captured here and they were taken there and then they were abused in this way, and then someone, a guy, kicks in the door and saves them. It's like, I'm not already with that. Let's go deeper. Let's find out what the real story is that will touch people in the deepest sorts of ways, like an Uncle Tom's Cabin or a War and Peace, and open up that. Now, I know that that writer, that filmmaker, that songwriter, that rap artist is out there, but they haven't gotten to us yet, to this issue yet. And it breaks my heart that they haven't. So I've completely subverted your question, and that's what I want intended to do.
I enjoy subversion.
With PSI, I've made 3 documentaries focusing on our grassroots programs and the poor and vulnerable people they seek to serve. And the one, I think that we've made them for National Geographic Channel, Discovery Channel, and VH1. And I think that the one that has had the most impact really did show the people the best. As you were saying, Kevin, and in particular, in Madagascar, I had the opportunity to work with some women who were... The place. But I had the opportunity to really spend some extensive time with some women who were trapped in sexual slavery and help them get HIV tests. And because of the technology available at that time, there was a really long delay to them getting their results. And so there was a built-in incredible dramatic tension. And the women, when they came to have their results revealed to them, we were talking about, you know, the appropriate way to do that and how immediately to start the intervention if they're HIV positive, and to reinforce safe sex behaviors if they were HIV negative. And of course, we were trying to help them exit their enslaved lives. They brought their children and they all got really dressed up, were as dressed up as they could. And so it was a really powerful moment, and miraculously, because of the work of a guy called Dr. Rene, who really just spends all of his time in the nooks and crannies of the brothels in that country, some of which are literally out on the street. They were all HIV negative. It was unbelievable. And I think that they had, I added it up, over 80 years of prostituted work amongst them. And for them to be negative was nothing short of a miracle. And that's probably the documentary that people approach me about the most. And as I said, you know, we've made 3 and they've been seen by over 1 billion people. So it is about the people. And the footage that we got in India, which in a way, as I just said, that I thought it sounded kind of callous. That particular documentary was very much about HIV, but we have so much film of me interacting with women and interviewing women who are sex slaves, and I'm looking to do something with that material when I graduate on the 27th of May. And so I want to be very thoughtful and do something, really harness it in an effective way, because it's staggering, and to kind of make an attempt to answer the question, which would probably take someone far more brilliantly artistic than I about why it's so effective. I just think the opportunity to have that reality brought into the living room can't be overestimated, because this one woman, for example, is living in an apartment building with children as young as 11 and working as a sex slave. The way she internalized her experience as a slave was a revelation to me as a privileged white Westerner. You know, and I was asking really embarrassing questions like, okay, when you're supposed to be going to a client, why don't you just go to the police? You know, and she's like, oh, because they raped me? Or Or, you know, why don't you squirrel away a little bit of money and try to buy a bus ticket? And she believed that in the whole of India, wherever she went, she would see someone in her family and she would be a victim of refoulement and sent back to her pimp, because she so believed that she was trapped. Anyway, there's a lot of amazing stuff I think that we can do with that, only in a way, hopefully, that is effective and not exploitative and focuses on the solution. It's abusive to point out a problem without highlighting the solution.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let me push back on both of you just a minute here, just for the sake of the debate. But there is, however, what we're talking about here is the documentary tradition is telling other people's stories for them, right, in many ways, right, representing people's experiences for the sake of raising consciousness, raising awareness, getting people to act, making them weep, and so forth. At the end of the day, you used Uncle Tom's Cabin as the example, so let me roll with that for a second. Uncle Tom's, Harriet Beecher Stowe had never been in Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had never met Uncle Tom. That was something that she invented, an archetype that was highly sentimentalized, highly feminized, and highly racialized, or you might use another word for it, that sought to get her audience to move and to act on slavery, but first to weep. And when I think about the stories of the vulnerable and the poor and the sick and the suffering and so forth, and the way that they often come to us, say in something like Nicholas Kristof's endless columns on suffering women and girls, which are fine, and they've raised consciousness, and they've moved some people to act, and they've certainly brought a lot of attention to these kinds of issues. But where is that line, like that and when do we cross over? When do we begin to kind of use other people's stories and simply to weep, simply to feel some kind of sympathy, as opposed to creating new opportunities for solidarity? And where is there in this documentary tradition room for folks to tell their own stories without us having to do it for them?
It takes a good documentarian to do that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you asked that question just the way you did about you know, bringing that emotionalism to the fore and having nothing to back it up. Because when I met with a group of students just before this, one of the things that we talked about was a lot of anti-slavery organizations, anti-trafficking groups that build their whole appeal on emotionalism and have almost nothing to deliver afterwards. And you know, I often think about people who want to be more righteous than they are right about this issue, and it worries me about the larger anti-slavery movement, because you can't. That's not a foundation. Emotion is where you start. It's not where you finish. It's just where you start, and you have to move as quickly as you can. And the right kind of documentary making is about people who may use emotion to open the door, but immediately come in with answers and like that. I'm a big fan of our own documentaries because we have a wonderful documentarian on our staff, and people say, boy, your documentaries about slavery are very strange because they all have happy endings. And they say, because everybody else makes really weepy documentaries. The other thing that I worry, though, about documentaries is that I'm wondering if it's not getting a little tired as an art or as a form. You know, I think back to the end of the 19th century when our organization was involved in the Congo slavery campaign, the almost forgotten campaign against slavery in the Congo under King Leopold. And they went with the first large format still cameras that were available, and they shot photographs of people who had been enslaved and also had suffered amputation as a punishment in their enslavement. A lot of photographs. And they brought them back to Europe and the United States, and they used a big, what was called a magic lantern, which was a carbon arc projector, and they would throw enormous photos, 80 feet tall, 40 feet wide, of people who had had their legs cut off or their feet or hands cut off because they hadn't done correctly in their situation of enslavement. And the power of those photographs in a world where there were no photographs in the newspapers, only engravings, and where the only photographs people had were the little tin types, daguerreotypes, and like that. It was enormously powerful and shocked the hell out of people and led to real change and the destruction. That was that new technology called glass slide plate photography, right, made this huge breakthrough. Well, you know, we're all over this with new technologies right now, but I don't see the power yet emerging from some of these technologies that I'm hoping for. And that the documentary forms are sort of predictable so often, and you feel like, well, this is one more of those sad documentaries, right? I'm looking for that new thing that's going to reach out and really grab people on this issue.
Do you think films on contemporary torture like Rory Kennedy's or Earl Morris's have had any effect on our public policy? I mean, have they?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think Ashley does.
I haven't seen Rory's film, and I'm remiss in that. And the question was whether or not the documentary Rory Kennedy made about torture, and has that had any effect on our public policy? And I don't really know the answer to that either. And I would like to put the challenge on our group here and say, you go figure out what the hook is. You go innovate and upgrade the genre so it can have an effective call to action that manifests real change. That's your job.
Yeah, well, that's the economic question.
Do you think we ought to open it up now, or do you think we have time
Just ask one more
for another
question.
question?
We'll start the economic.
Okay, because you've been involved in the economics of this too.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, my experience, aside from Amnesty, has been with Reebok and its business practices and how they tried to further human rights first by backing the Amnesty International World Rock Tours and getting people like Sting and Peter Gabriel and everybody who came with us, Meryl Streep, who did this stuff in Oslo before, to publicize the need for human rights. And then Reebok formed its own human rights organization and ran with and made sure that they at least had good business practices and tried, to eliminate everything from the sweatshops to children in Pakistan and India being in debt bondage to make drugs and so forth. And I'm wondering how effective you think that's been and how corporations and business communities can be creative about this.
It's a great question, and I have to say I'm very heartened by some new movements in that zone. LexisNexis, for example, are beginning the process of building a very positive business association for human rights, and they're a group that we've worked with in the past, and of course they're a great group to work with, not least because they have all this information and they're all about the law and the rule of law, but there's no way you can have slave-made goods in a computer file, except you can have it in the computer, but you can't necessarily have it in the data. So they can start from that nice position and then build it out. It's a puzzle we're still cracking, and certainly Reebok's a wonderful outfit in the sense that there are a lot of people who first heard about contemporary slavery when they gave the Reebok Award to Iqbal Masih.
I was thinking of him
back,
when I asked
yeah, back in the late 80s, and who was a child who was enslaved in Pakistan, and then was later murdered. We assume by
on the bicycle.
Yeah,
they gave him to go home.
yeah, on the bicycle that they gave him when he went home. He was then murdered, shot with a shotgun by, we understand, it's always assumed by the slaveholders of his area, who was a young man, he was a great hero, and his experience as a child slave radicalized a lot of children in the 1980s, including people like Fred Kielberger, who started to free the children in Canada and so forth. I think to my mind, my lessons over the last 10 years of working with industry have to do with the wonderful efficacy of closing the gap between industries and consumers. And what I mean by that is trying to begin the dialogue without the assumption of contention and conflict. Because I know a lot of people, and particularly university students, who assume they begin the process of thinking this through with the assumption that corporations are evil, and which is also a theme in almost every film. The villains are very often corporate executives and so forth. And I'm sure there are some evil corporate executives, but I understand there's some evil professors and evil students and all this. But not that I'm a big believer in evil itself. But the point is that there are also, in almost every business I've talked to, people who don't want to have anything to do with these violations. But they also don't know where to go with it. But the answer that they get when they try to address it is, you horrible people, why are you torturing children? And they say, well, we buy for subcontractors, advice for subcontractors. How are we supposed to find our way to this? Don't talk to us about that. We want to talk about how evil you are. There's been this disconnect. And I know that our experience with the chocolate industry has completely dispelled all that for me, because it's just been tremendous.
How does that work?
Well, there was the documentary film that we talked about that we made in 2000 broke the story of slavery and cocoa production in West Africa. We opened that whole thing up. That led to, with some help of people like some of the American politicians, what was called the Cocoa Protocol, a kind of treaty that existed outside governmental rules, that was a treaty between the chocolate industry on one side and human rights groups, anti-slavery groups, child labor groups, consumer groups on the other, and trade unions, right? So, in a sense, it was an international treaty that was without governments, very modern, right? Very global, right? Very postmodern, right? Now, that continues to get criticism from some groups who say, well, they just sold out to the industry. But here's where, let's look where the rubber meets the road, right? That coalition, which runs itself then a NGO called the International Cocoa Initiative, which is not run by the industry or by the non-industry human rights groups, but in a coalition which is consensual in its decision-making, transfers about $3 million a year into anti-slavery and anti-child labor work in West Africa. And on the back of that, the companies themselves transfer about another $3 million. So about $6 million a year goes to anti-slavery and anti-child labor work in West Africa that never would have occurred if we had remained in the head-butting, I'm going to chain myself to the railings outside your corporate office mode. And I just feel like, if you want to call that giving in, let's give in, because we need money to stop slavery. That's all there is to it. And if it means making relationships with people who are not of our normal tribe, then fine, because it's not just for us activists and students and artistic types. It's for everybody, it's a human thing. And anyway, so I feel very strongly about that. So when I understand groups who are calling for a boycott of this or a boycott of that, I also say, think very, very carefully about boycotting, because having worked on boycott campaigns during the apartheid period, and having people in South Africa assure us that we are the people who will be most affected by this boycott, and we ask you to do it. We risk starvation because we want to be free. But you can't do that with people in slavery. So that, when you have millions, literally millions, of cocoa farmers just in 2 countries of West Africa, who cannot answer the question whether or not they choose to have their livelihoods destroyed because we've decided that eating commercial chocolate is something that we're too good to do, right? I'm just not there. And likewise, the recent calls for the boycotts of Uzbek cotton make me very nervous, because I know that if that occurs, having spent some time in the stands, I know who will suffer. It will be the poor of Uzbekistan. It won't be the dictators who are committing the crime. They'll just continue to live the fat lives they live anyway. And they'll sell their cotton to the Chinese, who will buy anything.
That was the conundrum for Desmond Tutu.
Indeed.
Whether or not to have sanctions or not.
Well, let's open it up for questions from the, do you want to say
No,
something?
I would just say that I think it's really important to help sensitize American consumers, but it is a little bit intricate and nuanced, as you were saying, that we don't want to have these perverse unintended consequences where we actually create additional suffering for those we ostensibly think we're trying to help. And I had a clothing line for a while at a southern-based retail chain, and one of the slogans on which we operated was, I really believe that Southern women don't want to wear another woman's misery. And I tried to make this really visceral, vivid first-person connection between because we were the store is old, it's called Goodies, and they've been in C&D markets for many, many years, a family store. And I tried to make a real connection between the family that walked in that store and the family who may very well have been producing the goods they were there to buy. And I love trying to make those personal connections, and that's what I have to say about that, in addition to really agreeing with everything that Kevin said.
All right, we're going to open it up, but what we'd like to do is we want to make sure that people identify themselves and ask a question, not open up for become a member of the panel. And so you call on Elliot first, which is always a tricky enterprise.
My name is Elliot Prestfield. I'm a student here. I've been listening to or watching the discourse that inheres in slavery and the trafficking stuff, and I hear the passion and I respect it, but I'm interested in how it connects with other justice projects. How does the anti-slavery movement, what does it have to say about the maquiladora worker on the border between Mexico and the United States who isn't enslaved but has a really miserable life? I mean, right now it seems like a lot of the time the answer, the next step out of slavery is get exploited by capital. And I'm wondering how these things fit together. In the 18th century, 19th century abolitionist movement, fighting against slavery was fighting something very fundamental about what kind of country we want to be. Now it's somewhat like it becomes a way of deploying human rights workers to serve multinational corporations, one could argue. And I'm wondering if you could talk to this tension about how these things play together, work together, or actually work against one another.
Sure. You want
Well, immediately what came to mind for me was, it's so often girls and women, because of the feminization of poverty, who are at greatest risk for sexual exploitation in particular. And, I mean, you ask a very complex question, and I really should let Kevin go first so I can nod vigorously here so I know what I'm talking about. But for me personally, I think what my skill set is and where I can make a difference, I back out of that a little bit and go to educational, health, legal, civic empowerment for all people, girls and women in particular, but for all people, including indigenous groups and minorities. And the franchisement of those people will help improve their living conditions so that hopefully a transition from slavery is not one that's, a very subtle degree up to simply being exploited by profit-maximizing firms. And that's where groups like Women for Women International come in, because in addition to helping with some financial instruments and microloans and helping them start their own enterprises, there's a real emphasis on learning one's legal and civic rights. And what's so powerful about that is, in addition to increasing efficacy and agency, a woman or a man starts to take ownership of their place in society, and they can become an advocate on their own behalf and a real role model for those who are still not in as good a shape. And it does take, I think, a full complement of NGOs and social movements, because, for example, some time I spent in the Congo with women who've been reached by Women for Women International, as extraordinary and compelling and joyous as their stories were, they still weren't sleeping under long-lasting insecticide-treated nets. They still weren't using a modern form of contraceptive, which was staggering to me. But it goes to show that it does take everyone pitching in in the area where they can make the biggest difference. And so I hope that answers it a little bit.
Well, I have to say that there's an implication in your question about, the size of problems. And I'm not I have to say, I think a lot of us who work on contemporary slavery agonize a bit, because we know that there's a funny paradox about slavery. It's sort of one of the absolute, if you're going to make a continuum of horror, slavery goes at one end of that continuum, and it's sort of one of the most fundamental violations of our human dignity and so forth. And yet, the paradox is that if there are something like 27 million people in the world in slavery, it's actually a fairly minor problem in global terms. Out of 6.75 billion, it's pushed right up to the edge of our global society. It's illegal in every country, it's marginalized as a criminal activity, and that has both wonderful implications and the the suggestion that, well, why is this important anyway, and why aren't we thinking about the women in the maquiladoras and so forth? My answer to that, though, is that I actually believe that slavery in our whole human existence is a little linchpin that around which the hub of the wheels of exploitation spin. And I've come to feel this even more strongly in the last few years because as I've been expanding my own research work into areas of, and here's the examples that I'd give you to demonstrate what I mean by that. We've discovered that you can go into an area in the developing world and you can dramatically reduce HIV infection unless people are enslaved, who are involved in sexual exploitation, because you can't get to them because they're isolated because they're enslaved. You can move into zones where horrific environmental destructions occur, and you can reduce that unless you're in places where I've been studying this. I'm writing about this now. I've been going around the world looking at places where slaves are being used to destroy the natural environment. And you can't stop them because it's a criminal activity we're using slave labor. And so the environmental destruction continues even though the laws have been passed, even though the treaties have been signed and so forth. And it sort of rolls out like this. And certainly it's the case with labor as well. I mean, in the sense of productive labor in terms of economic production. That, you know, if I have come to the understanding of our economic analysis of what happens when you bring slavery to an end in a community in places like North India, that it raises all boats. That you don't have to end poverty to end slavery, but if you end slavery, you can go a long way to ending poverty, at least in a local community, because slaves become producers and consumers, and ironically, even ex-slaveholders do better economically, because they tend to own the shops where these new producers and consumers go to shop, and the whole local economy spiral up. It's what should have happened in the American South after 1865, but didn't. And so, to my mind, yes, I work on a minority issue, but I think it's a pivotal.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Jessica Percy. I recently finished at Harvard Law School and I'm currently working on 2 legal consulting projects regarding prostitution and trafficking. I was glad that we ended with the relationship between industry and consumers and slavery, because in my mind, that relationship for labor slavery is very different than with sex slavery, because a consumer of chocolate is demanding chocolate and can go and request a clean supply chain. But a consumer of sex is demanding sexual slavery. And there's a bit of a debate about whether you can ever request a clean supply chain for that. So I was hoping you could speak to addressing the demand side for sexual slavery and prostitution and trafficking, and what we can do to make movements around that.
It's a great question, and I'm actually quite recently converted to spending more of my energy on reducing with an eye toward wholly eliminating demand. And in particular, I've had the opportunity to work with some groups around the United States. There's an outfit in Georgia called A Future Not a Past that Deborah Richardson introduced me to, and also the campaign in Cook County, Illinois is a very good one. I've been learning about the John schools, which are perhaps counterintuitively quite effective, and it's important to, I think, decriminalize victims and women in prostitution, and to criminalize pimps and purchasers. And I'm really grateful for the work you're doing, so keep it up. There is going to be a demand-side conference in Cambridge the first weekend in May. Ambassador Swanee Hunt is extremely active on this particular side of the issue, and she's organized something great. And there's a guy here in town called Michael Shifley, who's an incredible researcher, very open to hearing from students, and I would, if you're interested in demand, encourage you to avail yourself of his information.
I was about to mention Michael as well, because he's.
I'm working for him.
And you're working for him. Okay. It's just he's brought scholarship and real solid analysis, and his analysis of John schools is brilliant work. And like me, he's a bit of a nerd, kind numbers nerd, so you have to kind of wait sometimes for the nuggets, but boy, when they arrive, they're really good. There are a couple of things that I'd say on this as well. I mean, one is that, like the work that Michael does, I do think we've been very long on outrage about demand, as we should be, but we haven't been far enough on analysis. I'm going to point to one thing in particular. We still don't know exactly how young men learn to buy sex. We don't know that. We know they do it, but it's not like learning to buy a piece of gum, which you learn from your mom when you go to the store. There's some kind of process through which men learn to do this. And I've anecdotally tried to pursue this, and I've talked to young soldiers and who got it after boot camp and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, in terms of a systematic way in which boys learn to buy sex, and what point then might be the intervention moment, we don't know. And if we want to reduce demand, that would be a really nice piece of information. And even though I've approached funders with that in the past, they're like, oh, I don't know about that. What's it? And likewise, we have yet to have a careful estimation within economics of the demand curve for purchased sex, right? I mean, if you were trying to eliminate or advance a market of any product, a horrible way for me to talk about it, you would bring in economists and do a demand curve estimation so that you could find the extinction point along that curve. And we haven't done that either. Okay, but to my mind, the fundamental answer to this question is with 12-year-old boys. You know, I think we've got to get to all the 12-year-old boys. And I've got to say, as a father of a 13-year-old who has now, in a good school system, learned everything about HIV, smoking, heroin, alcohol, but are they talking to him about the fact that someday someone may take him toward a brothel? No, right? And this is in a good, solid school system. Boys have to be reached before they get into that toxic zone. And that, I think, is the crucial answer to this. And I'm all for that. And I don't know how we're going to reach all the 12-year-olds, but let's go get them, because that's where they're cracking. And I've been really heartened by what's been happening in Thailand. They still have a terrible problem, but there's been a significant diminution in the number of young men, college-age guys, going to prostitutes in Thailand. And it's because cultural change has occurred in a place where I thought cultural change would never occur. And there, it's been mostly about teenage Thai girls saying for the first time, we don't go with boys who do that. And that has altered that behavior. Now, is it a huge change? No, but it's one that people have been able to mark.
I just wanted to add very quickly to that I think men have a real role to play with other men in disrupting purchased sex. And we talk a lot in Diane Rosenfeld's class about what happens in those male-only spaces, and why is it a guy who, with a woman present or perhaps on his own in everyday life, would never do the things that he suddenly will do when he's in one of those male-only spaces. And so there's a wonderful program called MVP, which is Mentors, MVP, Mentoring Violence Prevention, and it's about using men who do have have status in a group to talk about and model the healthy and appropriate, dignified way to regard girls and women. And I think pornography has an enormous exacerbating effect on demand for purchased sex. And so that's a whole other subject, and I am mad about it. I'll just leave it at that.
In the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Padmaja. I'm a student at the Ed School, and I'm so thankful for the founders here. Especially, I'm curious to know, after the last response to the question of educating men, educating boys, how do you connect that with domestic violence, and how do we reach them at homes? Now, if we talk about commercial sex, how do we prevent domestic violence where sex is not bought, but it's a right? And it happens within homes everywhere, within the U.S. and all across the world, even to women who are economically independent, financially self-sufficient. Where do we start education?
Well, three American women today will be murdered by their intimate partners or former intimate partners. And of course, intimate partner violence is incredibly underreported, and so it's happening at a far more alarming rate than the already disturbing numbers that we know about. And Just one tool that I will mention is there is a nurse, and unfortunately I don't remember her name right at this particular moment, that she has documented and created a intimate partner violence continuum. And so it is an inventory of behaviors. It's a checklist. And police and shelters, which is a whole other subject. Why does the woman go hide in a shelter while her batterer is free to move around society unconstrained, which is a violation of her rights as a citizen. She does not have the full protection of the state. The woman can begin to understand not only that she's being abused, but there are lethality indicators within her abuse. So that's just an example of a tool that's available, and I'll leave it at that.
And
It's a complicated thing.
It is complicated, and I'd add a couple of things, in a sense, almost to the side of that. One is that I'm glad you're picking up that parallel between domestic violence and enslavement, because if you look at the impact of enslavement on people's psychology and life, the trauma, you can best usually understand it within domestic violence models. That the people I've known who have been horrifically traumatized in slavery, if you look at their presenting behaviors and the whole how that all plays out, it's very similar to what happens in domestic violence. And many of the things that happen to people in slavery, the kind of giving over, the idealization of the person who's actually abusing them, the sense of sort of switching off and then living through, happens within slavery and happens within domestic violence. But the work has not been done to really build that bridge and understand how that works through. Likewise, in the same way that we've treated domestic violence as something which is separate from, that we're not supposed to necessarily talk about in the past, especially because this was about married people and about families which had their own zone that you weren't supposed to violate. One of the most extensive forms of enslavement that I believe exists in the world is forced marriage. You know, it's defined as a type of slavery by the United Nations Convention. But no work has been done to actually figure out how do we precisely tell which is a forced marriage, which is equivalent to forced labor, which is equivalent to enslavement, and which is a really crappy marriage. Right? I mean, we probably have some anecdotal accounts, right, about what that is, but we're talking about slavery, marriage, which is in fact a form of enslavement. Not like enslavement, is enslavement, right? So, I mean, I'm involved in a research project now with a co-author, and we're going to put a book together about this because we feel like somebody's got to get to grips with this idea of how much forced marriage there is, what does it really look like, how do we define it clearly, and how can we help the broader public actually see that there's something called forced marriage that's not the same as arranged marriage or bad marriage or whatever. It's actually a type of enslavement. And I think it's going to be a shock to all of us when we suddenly discover, oh gosh, this is in the tens of millions.
And you think it's worldwide?
Oh, it is worldwide. We know that. Anecdotally, we began the research last summer. We planned a 3-year research plan because we said, I can't go and talk to women in Afghanistan and say, well, my coworker, Jody, was going to have to go do these interviews. We began to ask around a little bit, and women who had escaped from forced marriage are flooding into the United States from all over the world, asking for political asylum, asking for human rights asylum, and so forth. And we were amazed that as we went around different law firms, they were saying, I have 5 of these, I have 12 of them. I have people like this in these situations.
So are we accepting it as the United States?
They're-
Because they
they're
certainly
beginning
didn't
to.
welcome anybody
No.
a
Yeah,
decade ago.
no, not a decade ago. There have been in the last 2 years, been a couple of rulings that have allowed forced marriage to be a legitimate claim for asylum.
And the genital mutilation?
As well.
Has that been included in this?
Yes. Yeah, that has as well. As I understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not the lawyer, my partner, the co-author's the lawyer. But
I also wanted to make sure I mentioned the International Violence Against Women Act has been proposed in the House and the Senate, and it has a really good, strong bipartisan support. Poe from Texas and quite a few others. And so I would certainly encourage American citizens to be in touch with your lawmakers and say that you unequivocally support the passage of that, which would tie a lot of U.S. diplomatic activity to the reduction of violence against women abroad.
My name is Catherine Wright. I'm actually a DC student at Boston College, and I was wondering, I know it's going to be kind of a lot that you can spin off of this, but for those of us that are doing academic work, master's, dissertation, like in this field, there's so many things and what is going to be the most important or effective. And so I was wondering if you had any, I know, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Other people have asked me, what should I write my term paper on? I know that, no, and I know that's not what you're saying. But I am going to dodge your question. I'm sorry, but I'm going to dodge it. And the reason I'm going to dodge it is because one of the things that for us as a community of scholars is so exciting is that we are an infant discipline. This is an area of academic and scholarly inquiry which is truly at the beginning. Truly at the beginning. And that is so exciting that I would not presume to suggest to you as a young scholar what you might want to do. I challenge you to use your imagination and dig in and say, and wait for that thing that really gets you going. Because we don't know, in some ways, what the most important things are. We know what we think they are, but we also know that in an infant discipline, when intellectual activity is beginning to build a structure of understanding, it's going to be a crazy young thinker that brings the insight that opens the doors to the whole part of that mansion that we never even understood was there. And the other thing about this that's so exciting to me is that the person maybe in this room who writes the fundamental work on women and slavery, which has never been written. The person maybe in this room who writes the fundamental work, the foundational work on conflict and slavery, which has never been written. There may be a person in this room who's going to write a foundational work on religion and slavery, which has never been written. You know, it's kind of like you're starting sociology and you get to be Durkheim, you get to be Marx, right? You get to be Max Weber, right? It's kind of wild that way.
And can I just add one quick thing, and this is something that has become very clear to me in the last year or two as we've been starting to do more and more of this work at the Carr Center, is that as we begin to expand this field, that we don't repeat the sins of our foremothers and forefathers and maintain our disciplinary boundaries and maintain these ridiculous binaries between the real world and activism and the academic world and intellectual work, right? That these kinds of boundaries that get erected are precisely the things that prevent us from moving in the direction of knowledge, but also moving in the direction of justice. And so if you are someone who is a young academic, who's a graduate student, undergraduates, some of you are doing the most interesting work. I just got done advising a PAE that is really, really asking some very interesting questions that scholars in the field haven't really been asking, and it was because some activists and an ambassador in the State Department asked them to do this research that they did it. So there's this really interesting intersection between government and policy, activist work, and the intellectual inquiries that we're trying to do here. My undergraduates are doing fascinating stuff. I've read papers by undergraduates on modern-day slavery and human trafficking that is pales in comparison to Kevin Bales' work, but that is advancing the frontiers of knowledge, but it's because they're opening themselves up to the insights from sociology and history and literary studies and anthropology and so forth, and allowing themselves to be activists and intellectuals at the same time, and giving themselves license to do that, that actually liberates them. And we're never going to be able to liberate anyone else until we liberate ourselves with this integrated work. Sorry, this is my thing. Can I get an amen? There we go. Next question.
I want to be a witness.
Hi. I had a pretty direct question about slavery within the United States, and related to slaves who are coming in from other countries, and the immigration policies that are affecting when they are found, or when those trafficking rings are found, those women are often, and men in labor exploitation, are often deported, and often begin the cycle of the same thing. And I wonder what solutions, if any, you have to that, especially considering there's a mandate to deport a certain amount of immigrants by ICE, by the withdrawal.
Brad, did you hear that question? You did? The reason why I asked Brad, if you heard your question, is that there's a true expert here, Bradley Miles, who's just been made head of the Polaris Project. And he knows the answer to that question so much better than I do, because his concentration of work is in the United States, and he knows those laws and those regulations inside and out. Do you want to answer that question, if you do mind?
Oh, sure. It's okay.
Stand up, Brad.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, but...
Sure, no, So I think it was a great question, and I think it's been a great discussion, actually. I've really enjoyed this evening. I think you're right. I think the immigration policies of the U.S. are very integral to addressing this issue specifically. I don't know how familiar you all are with this visa that's been created for victims of trafficking in the United States called the T visa, it was created with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. There's about 5,000 available per year. And the T visa comes with 4 hoops that you have to jump through in order to get a T visa. Hoop number 1 is you have to prove that you were a victim of a severe forms of trafficking in the United States. Hoop number 2 is you have to have been physically present in the U.S. on account of the trafficking. Hoop number 3 is you have to cooperate with reasonable requests from law enforcement to prosecute or investigate your trafficker. And hoop number 4 is you have to prove that if you were sent home to your home country, you would suffer some sort of severe or unusual harm and retribution. So it's a tough process to jump through all those hoops, and you can imagine just hearing me talk through them why that's a tough process. There might be some victims who aren't willing to cooperate with law enforcement, and therefore federal law enforcement won't sign off on the form that's required for the T visa. And you also can imagine how hard it is to prove severe and unusual harm being sent home to your home country. How do you say, yes, there's some proof that my family might be under threat from my trafficker? So of the 5,000 T visas that have been available per year, every year since the year 2000, which is maybe about 50,000 or so to date, I don't know what the exact current number is, but I think only around 2,000 have been given. So 48,000 visas have been left on the table in a period now when the immigration debate is so hotly contested. There's also something known as the derivative visa, which is once you get one of those T visas, you could bring your parents and spouse and children over to America because by you cooperating with law enforcement, you may have just put them at risk. One of the things that we're seeing, though, is that, so one of the things that Polaris does, we operate this national hotline for the country, and we're getting lots of calls, tips into the national hotline where people are saying, here's trafficking, you need to go find it, or here's a brothel, you should go find it. And one of the concerns that we have is, let's say we reported that tip to the federal authorities. Let's say they go to the brothel and don't find trafficking, but find a group of undocumented people who now ICE has stumbled across and now are going to deport. And so it puts us in this really interesting moral dilemma where we're sitting on this information. We don't know if it could be true or not. It could be trafficking. If it is, we should send law enforcement to go do their job to do something about it. If it's not trafficking, we may have actually just inadvertently, and a good Samaritan may have led to 3 unknowing people getting deported. And so what do we do with that? So we've been in discussions, and Kevin and I have been in some really interesting meetings just yesterday, talking about this very issue of could there maybe be some sort of bubble of protection where if the initial investigation into trafficking was the sole reason that an ICE agent went to a house and they didn't find trafficking, they would be willing to turn the other cheek and not prosecute or deport what they found otherwise. And it's a tough policy to think through, but there's some precedent for this, and one of the precedents for that is the Wage and Hour Division. The Wage and Hour Division goes around the country trying to find evidence where people aren't being paid a fair wage. And when they go out to a farm, they may find people who aren't being paid a minimum wage, and they want to do something about that. They may also find undocumented people in immigration violations. If the Wage and Hour Division gets seen as a Trojan horse for ICE, where they're turning over all these wage and hour implications and getting all these people deported, people aren't going to be willing to report their wage violations to the Wage and Hour Division because they're going to be scared. So we actually do think that there's a possibility. But I think people are looking into the guest worker programs, people are looking into H-2A and H-2B programs, people are looking into labor contractors and how labor contractors and fraudulent labor recruiters are using the H-2A and H-2B programs for this form where you can't change employers. Another visa, the A3 or G5 visa, is the diplomat visa. Kevin and I have talked a lot about this as well. When a diplomat comes over to this country, if they're on a certain A3 or G5 visa, they can bring their servants with them. And their servants only have that visa as long as they're working for that diplomat. And so in some cases, the diplomats say, wow, I have kind of an epiphany here, which is, you can't leave. And as soon as you leave, you become illegal. And so maybe I might not pay you accurately, or maybe I not treat you accurately. So there's been a whole level of dialogue into this A3 and G5 visa. But to sum up without being too long-winded, you're totally right. I think that T visa, all these things are a big issue to be looking into. It needs much more attention.
What's your name, sorry? I didn't catch it.
Oh, Brad with an organization called Polaris.
I'm familiar with Polaris. I work part-time for Mahari today. We're very familiar with your head. So
Great.
I'd love to talk to you after.
Sure. We have time for one more question. One last question here. Eric, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the last question. This is something that I talked with some of the colleagues in the room about. One of the things that is a huge opportunity, but maybe a huge pitfall as well, is the difference between the faith and the non-faith communities. I'm not a faith person myself, but I can see only endless opportunity for collaboration, mutual learning, but I know it's hard for many to see that as well. I wonder if you might shed some light on opportunities you've seen between faith and non-faith communities coming together, and ways that you could see for them to come together more in the future, and not just fight this together, but build upon mutual values to build sustainable dialogues, conversations, and relationships towards fighting this.
In the abolitionist tradition.
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I am a person of faith and have been since I was a kid. I think my God concept has evolved over time, and occasionally I fire God and get a new one. And I highly encourage you to have, as I do, a God who can handle my anger. And what I'm going to do personally on this, I've collaborated with a lot of FBOs because at PSI we have literally tens of thousands of partners worldwide, and I think that they overall make very good partners, but something I'm specifically doing is I am organizing a speaking tour of megachurches for 2010. The diaries that I've been keeping on my trips are being pulled together as a memoir and will be published in, 2011. And one of the demographics that I really want to reach out to in the United States is Christians. And so taking a look at the Pentecostal and Holy Roller and these big charismatic churches, some of whom are affiliated and some of whom are independent. And, Crystal Cathedral, Dr. Schuler has actually welcomed activists to talk about things like HIV in the past. And so I think that there's some precedent that I would be allowed to speak there. And it's a part of what I want to do because slavery is fundamentally a violation of my spiritual beliefs. And I think it's kind of nice that we're ending on this note because, for those of you for whom this turns out to be your pig, which is a family expression that everybody's got to find their pig in life. My godmother's pet is a pig. And so it's become this little thing that we throw in. You know what, it's their pig. Don't worry, that's just their thing. So when you find your thing, your pig, my experience is that it takes some form of a spiritual practice, however I define that, to sustain me, because the work is very difficult. And it's far too easy to become jaded, cynical, and to burn out. And God forbid that anyone in this room, with your intellectual capital and your ability to network, as we just saw, give up. And it's important to find something, whatever that thing is, that can and will sustain you. And so I came out of churches. It's not necessarily where I choose to worship now. Don't tell them that. They may not invite me. So I really hope to help start a movement where possibly even evangelicals and fundamentalists in this country fight modern slavery.
And whether you're interested in faith or not, one of the things about enslavement is that it's also the denial of a person's ability to express themselves in their own spirituality. People in slavery, their souls are crushed, and we rarely think about that. But that's yet another one of the many things that are denied to people in slavery. And of course, the wonderful thing is that we can choose whether or not we choose to express ourselves in a spiritual way. But slaves are denied that as well. But to answer your question in a broader sense, it is something that I struggle with myself. The more I've worked in this zone, the more I've realized how tall the walls are between faith communities and non-faith communities, and how to bring those groups together, I know it can be done because all over the United States there are fundamentalists and Pentecostals and Quakers and Jews and Muslims and all kinds of folk who are beginning to have conversations about this. But it's also true that they tend to be very often inward looking to their particular group. And it's the visionaries that are outward looking that you have to find first and to begin to knit those things together. And of course, you know, if you look back in the anti-slavery movement in this country before the Civil War, there was a significant amount of reaching across those denominational lines, and also the great rifts within the anti-slavery movement tended to occur along this denominational line. So they were both things that could be overcome, and they could also be the things that split them apart. So, you know, I hope that maybe the person who could do that is here. You know, the person who can understand how to build that coalition is alive and operating, because I haven't figured out how to do it.
Before I close, yeah, actually.
It's you. It's you. Okay.
Will you indulge me? I kind of want to share a story about a slave I've had on my mind all day.
Sure.
Because I think that what Kevin said about making it particular to individual people who are real to us is really important. And when I started with the first question that was asked, and I said, for whatever reason, the labor piece really gets to me, I just want to share a story about a guy whose soul, the last time I saw him, was not yet crushed, and his name is Mohammed. And he migrated to a slum outside of Mumbai looking for work because the push factors from the rural countryside in which he had been born were very strong. And he was sewing and lived in a very small room, not much larger than the size of this desk actually, with two other men. And they had a little space where they did their cooking, and they had their little bucket where they would fetch their non-potable water. And he was one of the most gentle people I have ever met in my life. And I was very touched by him because I didn't quite understand how he could maintain such a sense of loveliness actually while living and working in these abysmal conditions of slavery. And there was a little piece of jagged mirror that he had tacked onto the wall, and in this one moment he passed it and I was passing behind him, and our eyes met in the mirror. And I stopped and I said, Mohammed, what do you see when you look at yourself in the mirror? And he said, I see a beautiful child of God. And I said, that's what I see too. And when I asked him how he stayed alive in those circumstances, he said it was because he knew he was sending beauty out into the world, because the quality of his work was so fine.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. Before we close, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements about things that we have coming up.